The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the crisp morning air, wafting out of Café Lumiere's open kitchen window, as dawn painted the streets of Brookshire in warm hues. Jacob Remington, the cafe's owner and head chef, stood at the large steel counter, focused on the precise movements of his hands as he sprinkled herbs over a tray of golden pastries. The rhythmic sizzle of eggs on the griddle and the hum of early morning chatter from the dining area were like music to his ears. This was where he felt most alive in the pulse of creation, in the quiet moments before the rush. Today was like any other, or so he thought. But the man who waited outside the cafe's back door had other plans. Jacob glanced up and noticed him again, a thin, gray-haired man wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing, sitting quietly on the curb with tired eyes and cracked hands. It wasn't the first morning he'd seen him there. Jacob guessed he was in his 60s, though the years of hardship etched into his face could easily make him seem older. The first time Jacob had noticed him, he'd felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Pity, perhaps. Compassion. He wasn't sure. Back then, he'd left a sandwich on the windowsill before locking up, hoping the man would take it once he'd gone. By the next morning, it was gone. So each day, Jacob started setting out a meal, a small offering of warmth, one he never expected to be acknowledged. But today was different. As he prepared to turn away from the window, Jacob saw the man rise, bones creaking visibly with effort. Their eyes met. The man lifted a hand in a hesitant wave, lips curling into a ghost of a smile. Jacob paused, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. In the busy kitchen, the staff moved around him, oblivious. He had a decision to make. On impulse, Jacob strode to the door, unlatched it, and stepped outside, the morning chill biting through his apron. "Morning," Jacob said, unsure if he was overstepping. The man's eyes widened slightly, as though unused to being addressed directly. "Morning," he replied, voice gravelly, as if words were foreign currency sparingly spent. Jacob motioned to a small metal stool by the wall. "Sit. I'll bring something out." Jacob returned inside, scooping hearty servings into 2 containers: rosemary potatoes, sautéed vegetables, and buttery biscuits. He added fruit and 2 bottles of water before stepping back into the alley. The man sat stiffly, as though afraid the stool might be pulled from under him at any moment. Jacob handed over the food without a word. "Thank you," the man said, his gaze focused intently on the steaming meal. There was a long pause before he added, "Name's William." Jacob offered his own name and left it at that, sensing the man's need for privacy. He returned to his bustling kitchen, but all morning, his thoughts drifted back to William. That brief exchange was more than an acknowledgement, it was a spark of connection that Jacob couldn't ignore. Days turned into weeks, and the morning ritual became routine. William would wait, and Jacob would pack extra meals, sometimes sharing brief snippets of conversation. William spoke sparingly, revealing bits of his past: a mechanic before hard times hit, a lover of crossword puzzles, a man who once had a family. He never asked for more than what Jacob willingly gave, and in this quiet dance of give and receive, a fragile bond formed. One gray afternoon, Jacob noticed something was wrong. William wasn't at his usual spot. The curb where he sat was empty, an unease gnawed at Jacob throughout his shift. He checked again the next morning, pacing the alley like a restless spirit, until finally, William reappeared, shivering and drenched from an unseasonably cold rain. Jacob felt a surge of relief that surprised him with its intensity. "Let's get you dry," he said, guiding William inside the cafe. His staff glanced over curiously but continued with their tasks. Jacob led William to a corner, wrapped him in a blanket, and poured him a cup of steaming tea. The older man's hands trembled as he accepted it. In the warmth of the cafe's light, Jacob noticed for the first time how gaunt William had become. The realization hit him hard: 1 meal a day wasn't enough. "Stay here," Jacob said firmly. "Just for a while." William nodded, but there was fear in his eyes, as if he knew that accepting too much could make him lose the little he still had. He only stayed for an hour before slipping back outside, but Jacob knew he couldn't let this continue without doing more. Over the next few days, Jacob packed larger meals and started slipping in items like extra socks, gloves, and small toiletries. At first, William accepted them with silent gratitude, but one day he looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "I'm just a burden." Jacob crouched down, meeting his gaze. "You're not. Everyone deserves kindness, especially you." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded. William didn't respond, but for the first time, he took a deep breath, as though the weight on his chest had lessened by a fraction. It was a few days later, during a lull in the cafe's morning rush, that things began to take an unexpected turn. Jacob was prepping dough when a customer approached with an unfamiliar face, a young woman with a camera slung around her neck and a notepad in hand. She introduced herself as Mia Reynolds, a reporter for the local news station. "We've heard about the meals you've been giving to someone in need," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity and admiration. "A customer mentioned it." Jacob stiffened, caught off guard. "It's just food," he said, feeling exposed. "It's more than that," Mia replied gently. "We'd love to do a piece on it. Your story could inspire others." He hesitated, unsure if he wanted attention drawn to something that felt so personal. "I'm not interested in fame," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. But Mia's expression softened. "It's about showing people what kindness can do," she said. "And who knows? It might even help your friend." The words struck a chord. If this story could change more lives, maybe it was worth it. After a long pause, Jacob agreed, but only if the focus stayed on community compassion, not on him as a person. A week later, the news crew arrived. Jacob felt anxious as they set up cameras, interviewed staff, and filmed snippets of him preparing meals. They wanted to speak to William too, but he was nowhere to be found. Jacob worried he might have scared him away with the attention. As the crew began packing up, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake until he saw William watching from the edge of the alley. He walked over, careful not to spook him. "They're here to show what kindness can do," Jacob said. "If you don't want to be part of it, that's okay." William looked away, the lines on his face deepening. Maybe people need to see that we're real, not just a story." They returned together. William's voice cracked as he spoke on camera, telling bits of his story and expressing gratitude he never thought he'd feel again. When the segment aired days later, it sparked something beyond Jacob's control. Strangers reached out, offering donations, resources, and job leads for people like William. But the biggest surprise came when the news station returned with a stunning offer, something that would change both of their lives forever. The camera lights dimmed, and the soft hum of departing equipment filled the cafe as the news crew packed up. Jacob stood beside William, feeling a mix of relief and tension he hadn't anticipated. He'd let a crack of light into his tightly guarded world, and now there was no telling how far it would reach. William, for his part, seemed dazed, eyes flickering with uncertainty beneath layers of gratitude and apprehension. In the days following the broadcast, the cafe became a beacon for community members. It started slowly. A handwritten note of thanks slipped into Jacob's hand by a regular customer, a young girl shyly offering a bag of canned goods for anyone who needs it. But soon, the trickle became a flood. Donations piled up: blankets, coats, non-perishable food. People reached out with offers to volunteer. Jacob barely had a moment to take it all in before someone else walked through the door with yet another gesture of kindness. Not everyone was there out of pure generosity. Some came to gawk, to snap selfies, to peek into a human interest story made real. But Jacob chose to focus on the genuine helpers, grateful hearts whose motives mirrored his own. Among them was Ella, a retired social worker who offered to connect individuals like William with housing resources and job training programs. She radiated warmth and pragmatism, a perfect storm of empathy and efficiency. Together, Jacob, Ella, and a small band of volunteers transformed the cafe's back room into a temporary resource hub, where meals, clothing, and guidance were provided. As the sun rose each day, Jacob prepared extra portions, knowing that the number of lives touched by his food had grown well beyond his original intention. But for all that progress, one person's fate weighed heavily on his mind. "William, what do you want?" Jacob asked one afternoon after the cafe had closed and they shared a meal in the quiet of the kitchen. They'd fallen into the habit of eating together, even as William remained hesitant about receiving more than he thought he deserved. Today was different, though. Jacob needed to know. William stared into his soup, the steam curling like tendrils. "I don't know anymore," he admitted softly. "It used to be simpler. Get through the day, find a warm place, stay invisible." Jacob's chest tightened. "And now?" William looked up, his expression raw. "Now there are people who see me. It's terrifying." Jacob nodded, understanding the paradox. Visibility came with a price. "You deserve a chance," he said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "Whatever that means to you." That chance arrived faster than either of them could have imagined. 2 weeks after the news segment aired, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside the cafe. Out stepped a sharply dressed man who introduced himself as Robert Hale, a regional manager for a major restaurant chain. Hale had seen the broadcast and wanted to meet Jacob personally. But he wasn't just here to shake hands. "I'd like to support your efforts, Mr. Remington," Hale said, his voice deep and commanding. "And I have a proposition." Jacob braced himself. Propositions from strangers often came with hidden strings, and he'd learned to be wary of corporate goodwill masquerading as charity. Hale continued, sensing Jacob's hesitation. "We want to partner with you," he said, leaning forward with genuine intensity. "Expand your outreach, maybe even open a community kitchen or training program for folks like William." He paused, glancing at the older man. "We could use people with skills and heart like yours." William shifted, clearly uncomfortable in the limelight again, but Jacob could see something flicker beneath his uneasy hope. Jacob took a deep breath. This offer could amplify their impact beyond anything he'd imagined. It would also mean trusting someone else with his vision, risking more than he'd planned for. They spent hours discussing logistics. Hale's proposal came with financial backing, additional staff, and a framework for scaling up their community support. There would be challenges, of course: bureaucracy, oversight, the potential for losing touch with their grassroots ethos. But by the time Hale left, Jacob felt the first glimmers of cautious optimism. Over the next few weeks, plans took shape. Contractors measured the back room for renovations. Architects presented blueprints for a community kitchen that could train and employ people facing housing insecurity. Volunteers poured in, some offering specialized skills, others ready to simply lend a hand. William stayed close to the periphery, watching it all unfold as if from a distance. He continued to help with meals, but a new tension had settled in his shoulders. "What's bothering you?" Jacob asked one evening, as they cleaned up together. The cafe felt oddly quiet without the daily hum of activity. William scrubbed a pan with unnecessary force. "I'm afraid I'll mess it up," he said. "All of it. They're building something beautiful, and I don't belong." "That's not true," Jacob said, pausing his own work. "You're part of it. From the start." William shook his head. "I've made too many mistakes." Jacob crossed the room and placed a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder. "We all have," he said quietly. "But that's why this matters. It's about second chances for everyone." It wasn't a perfect reassurance, but William nodded, absorbing the words as best he could. In the weeks that followed, he pushed himself to step forward. He worked alongside the team, rediscovered dormant skills, and began mentoring younger volunteers who shared his struggles. Slowly, his confidence grew. He even started leading workshops, teaching basic mechanics, a nod to his former life, and helping participants rebuild bicycles. It wasn't grand, but it was something tangible, something real. The grand opening of the community kitchen and resource hub was both a celebration and a reckoning. The cafe was packed with supporters, journalists, and skeptics. Jacob delivered a speech he hadn't prepared for, speaking from the heart about how one small act of kindness had spiraled into something much greater. He acknowledged his fears, the unexpected journey, and the simple truth that compassion could reshape lives if only people chose to act. William stood beside him, hands trembling as he gripped a worn piece of paper with words he'd written down. When it was his turn, he stepped forward, pausing until the room grew silent. "But I want to say this: I was nothing before someone saw me. If you see someone, really see them, you can give them back their life." He glanced at Jacob. "Even if they don't think they deserve it." Tears welled in Jacob's eyes. This wasn't the culmination he'd imagined. It was more than that. It was a turning point for William, for the cafe, for everyone gathered. As the crowd erupted in applause, Jacob knew they still had work to do. The road ahead would be long and complicated, but they were ready to walk it. What neither of them realized was that their story wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about what happened when one person chose to pack an extra meal, how it could create ripples that changed countless lives, one act of compassion at a time. The applause echoed long after it had faded into the night air. Jacob watched as people milled about the newly transformed space, once just the back room of a humble cafe, now a bustling community kitchen full of energy and hope. The buzz of conversation filled every corner. Volunteers served steaming dishes with wide smiles, and William moved through the room, shaking hands, exchanging warm words, and offering quiet guidance to those who needed it. But beneath the celebration, Jacob sensed the exhaustion behind his friends' tired eyes and the gravity of all they had built. As the last guests departed and the lights dimmed, Jacob found William seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of tea and staring out at the empty room. The dim glow cast shadows across his face, but there was a gentleness there, a quiet peace that Jacob had rarely seen. Jacob pulled up a chair. "We did it," he said softly. William nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. I didn't think it would be possible." Jacob leaned back, letting the weight of their journey wash over him. "None of this would have happened without you." William's gaze dropped to his hands. "There were moments," he murmured, "when I thought I'd always be invisible. I forgot what it felt like to be useful. To matter." Jacob swallowed hard. "You've always mattered. You just needed a place to see it." Silence stretched between them, comfortable and full. They listened to the distant clinking of dishes and the faint hum of conversation from outside. Then William shifted, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crumpled note. He unfolded it carefully and handed it to Jacob. "It's from a young man I mentored last week," William said, his voice rough with emotion. "He said he's staying clean because he finally has someone to believe in him. I don't think I can take credit for that, but it feels like something real." Jacob read the note, words of gratitude scrawled in shaky handwriting, and felt a lump form in his throat. "You did that," he said, placing the paper gently back in William's hands. "And it's only the beginning." For a long moment, neither spoke. The magnitude of what lay ahead, the lives they would continue to touch, the obstacles still to be faced, hung between them. But there was no fear. Just a shared understanding that they had already faced the hardest part, choosing to care when it would have been easier to turn away. The next morning, Jacob awoke to the sound of rain tapping against his window. He arrived at the cafe early, preparing food as he always did. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and cinnamon, the familiar rhythm of chopping and stirring grounded him. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the gray sky, he stepped outside and placed 2 plates on the windowsill, a tradition he'd never quite let go of. He turned and found William waiting at the door, smiling through the drizzle, ready to help. They moved in step, tending to their work with quiet purpose. By midday, a mother and her child arrived, seeking warmth and a meal. Jacob and William welcomed them in without hesitation. Moments like this would be endless, a cycle of need, hope, and human connection. And it was everything they dreamed it could be. As the cafe bustled around them, Jacob looked across the room, catching William's eye. In that brief glance, a lifetime's worth of struggle, redemption, and quiet triumph passed between them. It wasn't a grand finale, it was an affirmation. Together, they had turned a spark of compassion into a flame that would continue to burn bright enough to guide anyone willing to step into its warmth. It was more than a story of a chef and a homeless man. It was a story of how one meal could change everything. And so, it continued, messy, imperfect, and beautiful. Just like life.